exploring the relationship between universal design for learning, UDL, and retention rates in a community college setting. My name is Cielo Cervantes, and this is a capstone project for Franklin University. This is the overview. We'll be moving pretty quickly to cover a wide range of content. What is UDL? UDL stands for Universal Design for Learning, and it's an educational framework. It's developed by an organization called CAST, and it comes initially from the field of neuroscience, and it looks at these different aspects of the brain and cognition. So it's the why of learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning, and those are divided into those three separate sections: engagement, representation, action, and expression. Below that, we see the subcategories for each of those, and basically it tells instructors how they can engage with these different components of instruction. So why is this important? Well, I work at MPC, Monterey Peninsula College, for the Access Resource Center, and I am an accommodation specialist. And so I work in the field of disability services for students, and my whole career has really been helping students. Down below you see an enrollment graph. This is specifically for MPC, and essentially there's been a 30% drop in enrollment. This also is definitely affected by COVID, but it's down, and it's still kind of bouncing back up, but there's a noticeable difference pre and post-COVID. MPC is a community college, and here we see a graph of all of the community college enrollments for a period of years from 2014 to 2022. And essentially you can see that it's pretty stable. COVID happens, it drops, but we're even kind of past that time and it's still quite low. So there's a difference between 2.1 to 1.6 million students. Pretty significant. And you also see a skills gain measurement, which goes from 27% to 11%. So not only are there less students, but students are actually achieving less from their educational outcomes. So that's a real issue. The problem with UDL is that there's very little research that actually can connect UDL instruction to outcomes of students. So when we're talking about outcomes, that might be success and completion rates, transfer rates, or retention. So this study will look at retention, but there's a problem of operationalization. So UDL concepts are inherently flexible, and they resist concrete definitions to measure implementation. So because everybody has different ways of understanding and applying the concepts, it's difficult to measure. So because of that, we don't really know its level of efficacy. It's a widely understood and adopted framework, but without that evidence, we don't really know to what degree it might be beneficial, especially in the post-secondary level. So that frames our two main questions. Can UDL be operationalized? Can we measure it? And can the impact also be measured? And if we can measure the impact, does UDL implementation result in better student outcomes? Some background. First, we'll talk about the medical model of disability. Traditionally in schools, disability is like a binary status. You either are disabled or you're not. And if you're disabled, you can talk with a counselor and receive a specific accommodation that addresses whatever your disability may be. But that doesn't fully address our current understanding of either disability or neurodiversity. Disability really has a wide range of spectrum of effects, and also unique combinations of disability that can also overlay with other types of social characteristics. And then there's this idea, which I'm calling universality, from the core idea of universal design. Universal design was from architecture, and it's to design by maximizing accessibility. You want something to be as accessible as possible to the greatest number of users. There's also another aspect, which is how certain things are designed with accessibility in mind, but then other people can benefit from those design considerations. The curb cut effect kind of highlights how accessibility can affect a greater number of users. Curb cuts are what were added in sidewalks that we now mostly take for granted, but they were originally placed there to give access to wheelchair users. And now bicycles, all kinds of different vehicles, strollers, etc., benefit from these. And then in terms of learning, there's multiple intelligence theory, which basically says that learning is a multiple modality type of process. So when you're learning something, you're kind of learning things in parallel. So if you're getting different types of information, or you're interacting with something in different ways, especially even simultaneously, that can actually improve your ability to learn and retain that information. So the hypothesis here is twofold. Is correlation observable from self-assessed UDL implementation? And also, if you can observe correlation, is there a positive relationship with retention? This study uses a mixed methods survey sent to a selected group of instructors that met a range of criteria. It uses Likert scale questions to build a UDL profile score based on UDL categories. The study includes attitudinal questions to assess universality, which is what the instructor believes in terms of how UDL instruction will benefit a range of different students. Will it affect only students with special needs that need that in order to access the information, or does it benefit everyone, more in alignment with multiple intelligence theory? And then it also measured significance, which is essentially how much the instructor feels UDL instruction will affect outcomes for students. The study also uses qualitative input to assess understanding of the instructors, their implementation strategies, and challenges that they face. Data analysis is used to compare the UDL profile score derived from the UDL categories and compares that with retention rates of various cohorts. So for the results, there's two essential questions. Can UDL be operationalized to observe relationships with student outcomes? And is there a positive correlation with retention? For the first question, potentially, but a self-assessment may be less reliable. We'll get into that a little bit more, but basically the results were mixed. And for the second question, a conflicted result. We'll look at that on the next slide. So here you see the UDL profile score in comparison to the retention rate. So what you're essentially looking at in this scatter plot is a comparison of z-scores that were calculated for each instructor that took the survey, and going from left to right on the x-axis, you essentially have the distribution of z-scores. So if somebody is more on the left, they had a low self-assessment score, and if they were on the right, they had a high self-assessment score, the UDL profile score. And on the y-axis, you have the retention rate. So looking at it, there's not a clear correlation, but you can kind of see a couple different patterns emerging. It does look like there's a kind of a weak positive correlation, but then there's also this group in the lower right-hand corner, which looks contradictory to a positive correlation. And in fact, that kind of throws the result into more of a negative relationship. So looking at the correlation matrix on the bottom left, you see comparisons between the different variables, most notably comparing the profile score. you see that you have a negative R score. This is the correlation coefficient. So it's inferring that on the whole, it's a negative relationship with the UDL self-assessment score. Other results for the attitudinal scores, you have universality, which came in at 12.8. That's on a 3 to 15 scale. So the instructors were generally very in favor of the universal model as compared to a disability model of UDL implementation. And for significance, which was a 1 to 5 scale, it was a 3.75. So instructors overall felt like it definitely was an important measure, but not the most important perhaps. Qualitative data that came back from the survey. Overall, there was a competent UDL understanding from the instructors and a wide array of active use, different strategies that they were using in the classes. They did express a number of common challenges, which were kind of categorized into these areas: time and workload constraints, accessibility and technology concerns, curriculum and assessment constraints, cost and resource limitations, and student engagement and classroom management issues. Overall, these findings do align with other previous research about actual implementation. Okay, and some more results and discussion about those results. Here's a data table of the scatter plot that I showed earlier, which is for in-person classes only. And it's sorted from the top, starting at 32. Max was out of a 35, and going down to 15 at the bottom. So higher profile scores on top, lower on the bottom. Now, going over to the other columns, there was the ARC retention rate, and then I also used a division retention rate and another rate from the state. And I was able to subtract the retention average from the division and then also from the California average. And this gave me a different score for each instructor. So the oddity that I found in the result was the highest ranking score. So this is about the top third ranking in the whole UDL profile, actually had some of the lowest retention rates. So those negatives that you see in the column next to the highlights are basically how much their retention rate is under the standard set by either the average from their division or from their respective subject matter from the state. So a lot of complex comparisons, but again, the key idea is that the top ranking group had the lowest retention rates. This graph here just kind of plays with what would happen if we had removed those. I suspected that it could be part of what they call the Dunning-Kruger effect, which essentially is a bias that people have in self-assessing their own ability. And it's possible that if some instructors weren't really familiar with some of the UDL terms and implementations, they might have thought that they were doing a little bit better job than they thought they were. Or it could be that there are just a lot of different complications involved with UDL implementation. And it could also be that the implementation of UDL is just inherently complex, and so one way of implementing it just may not be equal with another way. So limitations of the study. First, there is no operationalization standards for UDL, and this is a kind of a known issue. It's inherently complex with its conceptual mapping, and there's a lot of mixed interpretations about what UDL means and how to implement it. Secondly, the self-assessment cognitive bias, that definitely played a part in the results that I received in the study. Third, the study only uses DSPS data that relates to our ARC program, which serves only students with disabilities. And that's sort of the fundamental starting metric by which everything else is compared. So that's a major limitation because it really only speaks to that population, and it doesn't have an accurate measurement of the universal aspect, really, of finding, does UDL instruction improve outcomes for the general population of students? And lastly, time and resources definitely makes a difference here. Recommendations for future study into UDL implementation. First, having a specific population and a smaller cohort. So something that's just more focused, more narrow. I think one reason why the correlation is weak is that you have so many different subjects and such a range of factors involved with especially something like retention. Different kinds of classes have a range of difficulties, etc. Secondly, there should be a disambiguation of UDL in relation to standard pedagogy. So, to put that simply, some of the UDL framework really overlaps with what people would consider to just be good teaching practice. And so that difference, as compared with something that is much more intentional about improving access for students, it kind of muddies the results that we would see. So I think either a more specific focus on things that are outside of the normal pedagogy, or kind of a weighted framework would be the way to go for measuring. Also, the assessment probably shouldn't be in a self-assessment survey form, which should be from other forms of assessment, including students, interviews, or some other third party. And finally, what did I learn in this project? Well, I learned a lot about UDL. I learned how to process a large amount of information. It was necessary to calculate a lot of class records to find retention rates for a range of different subjects, online, in person, etc. And then to find ways to reduce that information into an understandable and relevant form. I also learned a lot just about the general scientific method. Actually putting it to practice was a very valuable exercise. Plus, I think some of the concepts here are hopefully useful to the UDL and educational community. While it doesn't exhibit a strong result, I think there are seeds there that are interesting, and I think with more focused, more fuller data sets and methods, I think it would be able to successfully connect UDL instruction with outcomes to see just how effective it is in helping students. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to Franklin University.